right. And so with that, I think as you know, I don't know if there's a rhyme or reason as to why you're all here, but you're all in this group. And so we get the chance to focus in on some of more of these zoning and regulatory strategies first. And we'll get to category E as well with some of these funding pieces. But first, we wanted to just have one more bite at the apple to go over some of those category A strategies about expanding housing options and different zoning strategies, reducing minimum lot sizes. And that is our first piece. So let's see the best way to get at this. Would you like to see a short list or the more detailed list of this to guide our discussion right now?
Can we
Maybe we
start
should
with the
start with the
short?
more detailed list. I think.
Okay, I'm hearing both options, but let's go with this one.
Well, I was thinking to just do the short first, just so that we kind of get oriented and then we can dig down.
Yeah, okay. So really quickly, here is that overview of the 7 different categories. So the first one is probably the biggest, is about reducing minimum lot sizes for single family lots in different low density zones, as well as introducing lower minimum lot sizes for middle housing. That's where we've also had some discussion since that meeting about reintroducing what used to be called the infill ordinance that allowed smaller lot subdivisions. We're still working on a new name for it, but it would be something like a 2,000 to 3,000 square foot lots for detached single family, and how that would work, where those would make sense to be located. Also looking at increasing the minimum density, revising maximum density, possibly some upzoning. We heard less interest, I would say, in this upzoning land in the discussions that I was part of it last month. More of a focus on A1 of working within the zones that we have, but would certainly be interested in getting further feedback there. Looking at expanding the different middle housing types that are permitted in those existing zones. An alternative, though, would be to introduce something like a middle housing overlay zone that applies, not across all low density zones, for example, but in more targeted areas, possibly closer to, higher amenity areas like commercial nodes and corridors, or parks or transit, those kinds of things. Also looking at whether we could offer bonus density. And then that last strategy that we were talking about, these residential uses in commercial zones, whether that commercially zoned land could be a resource for residential development, possibly all residential or potentially just targeting affordable housing projects. So that's the overview. Thoughts or, yeah.
Yeah, is it okay to just start asking some questions now or
Yes.
getting more specifics?
Yes.
So on 8.5, limit competing low density use in medium and high density zones. What does that actually look like?
Yeah, great question. So what we were talking about there, if we drill down into some of the specifics, has to do with thinking about, we've heard anecdotally that in the medium density zones where there's supposed to be a variety of middle housing currently, that because the low density land is getting so expensive and the lots are so big and then the homes are so big, that there's this pressure to move into the medium density zones where you are permitted to do single family detached residential on smaller lots. And that's A5, 6 here. And that then all the medium density land gets sort of eaten up for these single family detached uses that are getting squeezed out of the low density zone. And that likewise, A57 here, there's this concern that in the high density zones, then, because there's the squeeze from the low density to the medium density, that then townhouses are permitted in high density zones, and that those sort of wind up cornering the market, and or that there are I don't know, more townhouse projects than someone thinks are the right number. Mainly just that there's townhouses, but not as many higher density apartments on a limited land supply. So concern about, should a townhouse in the high density zones and these single family detached in the medium density zones, would limiting those make it more feasible to develop greater variety of housing, such as these middle housing types and higher density apartments in those zones. So it was sort of a carrot and a stick, right? Do we just offer the carrot of permitting more residential uses, or do we have a stick of cutting some things off the list so that the remaining menu options overall provide more balance?
Well, isn't that where it would just come in if we had higher minimum density requirements that are in alignment with what the zoning is, so that the individuals aren't faced with expensive options in their probably appropriate zoning, or going into a different zoning where they're able to game the system with lower densities than the zoning requirements are?
Yeah, definitely. Increasing the minimum densities in those zones is one way that we could get at this. And I think, so that's one tool. It doesn't, you could still see small, expensive townhouses, and maybe, there's a preference to see multifamily. And it's also a question of what is the zoning code's role here? Is it to say this site needs to be developed as X, or is it just to say any property developed in this zone has this choice between 5 different things, and it's up to the market to decide?
Well, what's our experience with the density and the use of townhouses, or even triplexes in that regard? I haven't found that they have really pushed the envelope much from what I've seen in the concept of utilization of the land. It doesn't seem like you get down into below 1,500 square feet per dwelling.
I only have, sort of some anecdotal permits and site plans from the last couple of years, as well as the reflections from the county staff. But I would agree, Ron, that's what I've been hearing as well, that there's sort of a natural limit to what can be achieved through the townhouse form. And so maybe we, could consider that when developing a minimum density.
So,
And just one other thing that we've discussed is, maybe this is a 2-prong strategy, right? On different timelines. The first phase is to introduce more housing types, and that it's 5 to 10 years or some other timeline down the road that then these other uses are more limited. So any other thoughts from the group about timing and priorities? Nancy?
Mine is not about timing and priority, but it was really about the 2,000 to 3,000 square foot lot for detached single family homes. Is that assuming that a homeowner who has a bigger lot could subdivide or condoize? I mean, is that an assumption that we should or should not make?
I think it could certainly support those kinds of developments. Yeah, I don't know that it is, as I've heard it described, it's more for a 1 to 2 acre vacant parcel that could be divided, but certainly it could be a 1 to 2 acre parcel that has one single family home on it and wants to make better use of a really large backyard instead of having to mow it.
Right, but if we're talking about, just normal housing tracts, they're 5,000, 5 to 6,000 square foot lots. And if they're, let's just say that they have a 1,500 square foot house on it, they could logically divide it into 2 or 3, but
Okay.
where you're going. Right, to short plat it, it's costly, but if they were to condoize it by building 2 ADUs and then selling them separately, that's a different process. So I was just wondering what was the intent of this particular proposal.
Yeah, to go briefly on that topic, the intent was not to target those 5,000, 6,000 square foot lots and provide an option to subdivide there. It was more about the slightly larger lots. If you have, you know, a platted 5,000, 6,000 square foot, I think just as you're saying, it's about adding an ADU or two and providing options that way. So the middle housing is going to be the best path for those properties.
So I think all of these have some sort of merit. What we're missing, though, is perhaps getting back into the aspect of what problem are we trying to solve with each one. And the idea of affordable housing in middle housing range really still gets us back to the idea that if we have to come down to roughly $350,000 target pricing for land and structure for sale, then the aspect of this is how much can we affect the pricing of the land or the ability to break a place off. If we're looking at this as in the context of affordable for rental housing, it's a completely different kind of problem, because we really are back to the idea of people that can afford to rent in this type of range of detached single family or townhouses. They're going to be subject basically to just a supply and demand. And so we could, in theory, create a much larger supply if we made it cheaper for the developers to build, expecting those all to pretty much turn into rental housing. So I think we have to kind of decide what it is that we're really looking at also, and the outcome. How will any one of these individual items shift the market for one aspect or another?
Right. And I think that, I forget if it's objective 2 or 3 that we've sort of been trying to score these on, is one of them is about providing diversity of tenure, right? Does it support rentals? Does it support homeownership? Does it support both? And you're right, we're on to point that different strategies are going to support those in different ways. Nancy, I see your hand up. And if anyone else, I can't see all the floating heads. So if anyone else has their hands up, jump in.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you brought up, Ron. And given all the alarming news about hedge funds and banks buying up houses and driving up the prices of rentals, I'm really big on, I'd like to have us really think about affordable ownership. So that means if they, instead of getting into a 5,000-6,000 1 acre lot, that they can buy a smaller one, like 2,000-3,000 lot, there with a smaller house. So I'd like to encourage us to start thinking small lots, smaller lots, smaller footprint, smaller houses, smaller price tag. And I think that would probably go a long way. I mean, affordable rental for sure, but let's not forget people who aspire to, buy homes.
All right, Stephen. Stephen, go ahead. I see your hand up.
We sort of tend towards one extreme or another. And what I mean by that is we're either talking about the kind of detached single family homes on 5 to 6 or larger lots versus multifamily structures. And in, for example, Pleasant Highlands, which is where I live, there are a couple of cottage developments going in, which have moderately sized homes on smaller lots and sort of common areas with assigned parking spaces so they don't impinge on individual yards. People seem to want to have or to preserve the idea of a private structure. But if you have common areas, you can possibly achieve more affordable housing, denser housing, but still have the sense of being in a more private neighborhood.
Great. Yeah, we are definitely wanting to look at cottages and these other, in our
Yeah.
jargony terms, right? We talk, let's see, where is this one? Middle house.
And if I could raise one other point for a minute, and that goes back to the A7 strategy.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe it would be useful to refocus how we look at mixed use areas, because so far what I've seen is putting residential structures in commercial areas. And I don't see the reverse considered, which is to carve out small commercial areas in primarily residential neighborhoods. Again, for an example of where I live, Philbrook Farms was recently developed, about 250 homes. And there was a set aside for a small commercial block, which, as near as I can tell, has not been developed and may not ever be developed. But it seems that there are a couple of goals that we talk about. One is more affordable housing, somewhat higher density. But I think we also have the goal of trying to reduce vehicular dependence.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're only talking about having residential structures in primarily commercial areas, you're not doing anything to reduce the traffic around primarily residential areas. And you're also not doing anything to help people age in place. And if you had dispersed throughout primarily residential areas, small blocks of maybe 3 or 4 stores
Mm-hmm.
that are walkable, I think that helps reduce the vehicular pressure and encourages physical activity and the other things that are desirable for, and let's face it, Clark County, especially in the unincorporated areas, is an area where aging in place has a high pressure
Yeah.
to accomplish.
I am going to seize upon that transition to talk about these, exactly that strategy. And let's see, in B2 is where we talk about this. So not only B1, B2.1 and B2.2 talk about ways to address that ground floor use in commercial and mixed use areas and looking at some pressure, but strategy B2.3 is exactly what you're talking about. And I believe we developed it,
Yes.
yeah, as part of this discussion to introduce this neighborhood scale retail and service. Is it a coffee shop? Is it a yoga studio? Is it a doctor's office? Within residential neighborhoods. And so we,
small grocers, for example.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Small scale. The corner shop, right? Long-standing tradition.
Right.
I say doctor's office because in my neighborhood, there was my doctor was 2 blocks down. And when I cut my hand and needed stitches, like my parents walked me over, to get stitches instead of getting in the car. And it was a real asset. So exactly, thinking about those. So we're looking at some of the ways we thought about to get at that. We're looking at some neighborhood commercial zoning, particularly some criteria about, how do we find those sites and prioritize them. Perhaps, even permitting those uses in a residential zone rather than having to rezone, a small parcel. And then thinking about, I sort of added this last one about economic development efforts. This goes beyond the code, but thinking about how we're creating these spaces, but even as you say, zoning code is this tool, and in your neighborhood with this example of this property has been set aside, but who knows if it's going to get developed. That's a lot of the
Right.
concern about some of these ground floor retail spaces as well, that there's at least two battles to be fought of getting the space built, but then getting it used. And so perhaps there are some ways to partner with economic development and support small business owners. Maybe these are entrepreneur spaces or, micro business launch incubator kinds of things where, we're supporting community members to get their business off the ground. So maybe there's some matching that could be done there. So other thoughts from, I'll just use, again, keeping us on track. We'll move on from A unless anybody needs to come back to it. But, as we move over to B and just dive into B2, thoughts about either of these aspects, changing the ground floor commercial and or increasing neighborhood scale commercial within actual neighborhoods in terms of what priority this is and what strategies would work best.
So my experience in planning commission is many times we are faced with a residential area with neighborhood commercial on it, and it's the last parcel in a densely developed area, and nobody has stepped up to try and develop it, build a building, and then put businesses in there. So a business can't go in there if there's no building.
Right.
And it's very, very rare for a business to buy the land and build a building. And so we're faced with the idea of the risk versus the reward for the development community. So I like the idea that if we were to work with, let's say, CDRC and talk to them about helping us lower the risk for developers, jumping in, getting some developmental money that could help try and lower the risk or create more tolerance for the idea of building the building. What Stephen is saying, I think, is very valid in the idea of our overarching goal. The problem comes that nobody wants to be the ones with the building that doesn't get rented out. So we've had a lot of pressure to change neighborhood commercial into residential and flip it just into residencies after a period of time of a parcel being on the market. And I'm talking 5-10 years in different situations where they have sat vacant while the development of the residences all around has happened. In the context of the bottom floor stuff, I think that's not only real good, but I think we have to kind of force some of these issues. We're really talking about old style ideas of the boundaries between what is commercial, what is residential. And I think we need to try and blend much more where possible, because ultimately what you end up happening is when you have rooftops that have people in them, you also have customers. Mm-hmm. And depending upon what kind of services is being offered, there's better opportunities for people to do commercial in an area that has within walking distance customers. So I think that's really vital for us to be able to do something that says we recognize that we have to change the presentation. And this is one way to solve more than one problem.
Thanks. Other thoughts on this strategy before we talk about some others here? Okay, let's just, for purposes of order, let's go up to, ready for a big one? Let's talk about parking. So, right, we're certainly weighing multiple factors here: costs, land area, feasibility, but also, many people get around by cars, and there are some demands. I won't necessarily say needs, but there are demands for parking that's easy and convenient. And so thinking about ways to balance that, we had that broader conversation, the way that I was framing it in the presentation about, is it we're looking at very large categories of across the board reductions? Is it targeting reductions to very specific developments based on characteristics and locations? Or is it more discretionary site specific types of parking requirements that we want to see developed? In addition, so we can talk at that level, or we can talk through some of these, specific targeted strategies brainstormed here. But curious to get your thoughts about this.
Yeah, so on that, I saw some more radical approaches of it was very site-specific, discretionary parking. And I'm just wondering, what's the burden of work on the county right now to evaluate parking? And if we were to go down a more radical side,
Yeah.
what does that look like? And what does that lead to, like planning and development time?
Sure. So I would say what I know, the county currently has a couple provisions that are discretionary in the code, where a developer can do a parking study based on the site and based on, comparable case studies and propose different parking. And the way it's written, the burden is really on the applicant rather than, there is some county review of it. But what we've heard from the community planning staff is that, or community development staff, is that not many developers take up that option. It's really too much of a hurdle to get through. And I don't know, that's typically how a process like that is structured in the land use framework. If we really want to blow our minds and think big, is there a way that the county could take on the effort of doing these site specific considerations? It would be a real paradigm shift. And I don't know technically how the county, might run a process like that, but anything's on the table at this phase if we're missing it.
Why don't we just make it one parking spot per dwelling and then let the market drive out the desire or willingness to pay for additional parking?
Yep, that's an option on the table. Ron, are you suggesting for all development, all residential development, or specific types of residential development?
Well, if you want to take the burden off of staff,
Yeah.
make it one, and then everything else is going to be paid for by the developer.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth?
Yes, please.
I really like the idea of reducing the under B16 that says reduce parking requirements for all multifamily included blah, 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 within access to transit. So it makes sense that the closer you are to transit, the less you need a parking space. And then perhaps for the people that are in areas that don't have access to transit, or have something where they equalize, let me get my thoughts, where there can be a fund that goes towards developing more transit as it's getting densified. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, this is a good template to say, okay, if you're adding density to where there's going to be transit, I can take a bus, I can take whatever. Of course, most people will probably prefer to drive, but they have it, so there's no need. But if you're living out in Ridgefield or Battleground, where your nearest pharmacy, or grocery store is 3 miles away, well, you need a parking. So I really like that, that idea.
Yeah, and I would say, let's see, there's at least one research paper cited here, and from my limited forays into this world about transportation, access to transit, and the size of the dwellings, as well as, I think it's the number of occupants, which obviously is going to track closely with the size of the dwelling. But those are like the three biggest factors that affect parking demand from residential structures. And so, I think there's a chicken and egg aspect, right, to parking in terms of people say, well, we don't have this now, so we have to require the parking. If there's always parking, no one's going to be encouraged to try different transportation options. And we're also sort of locking our communities into a certain model. But the evidence that we have does support that access to transit does reduce parking demand. So also, this one is a state requirement, as it turns out, to at least meet some of these numbers that are listed here. So we'll certainly need to look at reducing for transit, and we can think about whether we further refine the state requirement at the county level. But that sounds like a promising strategy. Other thoughts about, well, I guess maybe we start broadly, right? What kind of problem are we trying to solve here with regards to parking, and which of these strategies might get us where we're going?
That gets us back to the aspect of the price of land
Mm-hmm.
and how much you spend creating asphalt for parking the vehicle, and how that stormwater runoff, and then that goes ahead and makes your stormwater facility larger, and it is all the cycle all around the car.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'll just get back to the idea that, say, if a developer wants to pay for it because that's the target that they're going for, then they'll pay for it, and the people who are buying will pay for it. If we're trying to create affordable and options, I think we need to be able to kind of crack this egg a bit and really show them that there's other alternatives when they say that there's nothing that they can do except for open up more land, and which drives more streets and more stormwater facilities by itself. Maybe there are some other things that could be done.
Thanks. Stephen, please.
Yeah, I think one of the problems here is you have competing objectives that you're trying to satisfy. I mean,
You said it.
reducing on-site parking requirements does make the land a little bit cheaper, but then it creates pressure for on-street parking if you don't have the public transit alternatives. And of course, that also increases traffic congestion. So I guess it's a question of how you try to achieve both objectives and lessen the pressure on the available land. I mean, I don't have
Mm-hmm.
a good resolution for that, but I think that has to be considered, that it's not just a matter of how much it's going to cost the developer to provide the parking space. It's what other pressures you're creating by not having the parking space.
Right. And I think to your point too, it's not just about the site, an individual site, it's about the neighborhood scale and the
Right.
community scale and the network. Yeah. Nancy, I saw your hand up.
So this is totally kind of thinking outside the box. So
Love it.
so instead of using the paradigm that people have to own their cars, why don't we think about the car share model? Meaning it is kind of like a hybrid, right? If public transportation is not available, but car ownership is, not sustainable, what if we create like a parking lot of, let's just say, I don't know, 10 cars per 5-block radius, and invite companies that have these kind of car share, or encourage the creation of car share systems like zip cars. And there's like a bunch of others that are coming up where people just rent out their cars. They park there, and then the neighborhood could use it. I mean, totally off, out of the box, but that would actually create the solution perhaps that we're looking for.
Right, sort of a bridge, as you say, between transit and individual car ownership.
Yeah.
Right. And my code brain says, oh, I can write code about that. That if somebody wants to do a car sharing model, then they have a different way. Then then they're not subject to individual parking requirements. And I think that also helps us, could be a part of the piece of thinking about these different timelines, right? We're building today, but these developments are going to be around for, 50 to 100 years. So, and what does car ownership look like in 100 years?
Exactly. Now, like, people are getting their wardrobes shipped once a month.
Yeah.
I mean, right?
You can rent all your furniture too, I've heard.
Yeah, you rent your furniture, you rent your clothes, and so why not rent your car so you can drive a different car every week? I mean, I think our minds are being changed. We're slow, some fast, into a new way of consumerism. So less ownership and more about variety and experience.
Thanks. Okay, any thoughts? I should probably keep us moving. So anything else about parking, feel free to jump in, but let's see, design standards. Let's talk about B3. We've definitely heard about the Highway 99 plan. Is there some simplifications there that would still get at the overarching goals? I think where the real opportunity here is not undoing the whole plan for some of the key arterials and mixed use areas, but perhaps specifically looking at these mixed residential areas is what they call that. That's where we would expect to see a lot of this middle housing. Now that the county, as part of this process, will be developing more of those standards for cottages and townhouses and whatnot, can we use the same county level standards for those in the Highway 99 sub area rather than having separate standards for those middle housing uses? Can there be one ring to rule them all? Is kind of what we're thinking about there. There's a lot of work on cottage housing, which I think really gets to like, what does cottage housing mean, right? Is it these homes clustered around a common green space, sort of the more traditional cottage clusters that we've seen? Is it about, pushing those homes smaller to make it more almost like a tiny house community? Is it about making them, bigger so that it's almost like a small lot subdivision? But sort of what your vision of cottage housing is will drive what the solutions are in strategy B3 too. And then this other specific one has to do with the open space for larger multifamily. So any of those pieces or other design standards that we should be looking at here? Nancy.
This is not a well-edited thought, but as you were asking the question, I think affordability is a big issue. And because we're measuring cost based on square footage, that it makes sense to reduce. I mean, this is just my drum that I beat,
Yeah.
right? So if we build smaller on smaller sizes, then the cost will be less, both for rental. Well, maybe not so much for rental, because studios rent for more per square foot than say 5 bedrooms, etc. That's not a proportionate.
It's not linear, no.
It's not linear, right? But for ownership, for buying, if you buy a house that's 800 square feet and on a small lot, that will drive the design, right? The design will then follow affordability, if that's the solution that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. So you're thinking about, how do we support these smaller homes in the cottage housing standards? Is that where you're going here?
Yes, and I mean, that would be a driver to, okay, so we're how do we design these houses? Well, what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to get as many people in there while keeping the same, enjoyment life standard as possible. And so let's just build it small enough so that they can still have an ease of life, but be affordable. I mean, I apologize. I don't have all the jargon and the technical terms, but
Mhm.
I'm just thinking from a consumer's point of view.
Yeah.
If I want to go rent a house, the smaller the space. Anyway, so
Got it. Yeah, definitely ways to get a quality of life and amenities in a smaller package. Great. Stephen, did I see you are ready to chime in?
Yeah, yeah, I did have something to contribute on this, and I think Nancy's quite right that how you design these really kind of rests on what you're trying to achieve. And with a cottage subdivision that's going to be built a couple of blocks from me, um, a lot size is smaller, which is good, and the builders are planning to angle the individual structures, so it's hard to see from my bedroom into yours, which is also good. But a lot of these, maybe all of them, are planned as two-story structures rather than being somewhat smaller. And the issue I have with that is that if you're looking to encourage people to, for example, age in place, or you're looking to provide more housing in a smaller space for people who, for one reason or another, want the single family dwelling, then you need to concentrate on somewhat smaller square footage. And I think it's clear that some of this is just a product of what's happened in expectations for family housing between, say, the 1930s and now, because a 2,000 square foot house in the 50s, I think, was somewhat of a rarity. Certainly nowhere near as common as it is now. And I think the other thing is two other things. One is, I think it's possible to have a satisfying floor plan with less square footage if you're really clever and intelligent about how you design the layout and the flow of these places. We stayed outside Yellowstone for a week in a place that was 450 square feet. And it seemed spacious the way they laid it out. And we just marveled at the intelligent use of space and separations. And I think imagination can go a long way in satisfying people's needs in a smaller space. But I think you also need to look at the balance between common and private outside areas too, because especially up here, you have a lot of people who want detached dwellings because they want a vegetable garden. Well, a vegetable garden doesn't need a 7,000 square foot lot. So again, like Nancy, I don't know how well thought out this this comment is, but it's kind of my of consciousness.
Yeah, no, thank you for all those thoughts. And it is, I mean, I appreciate that this group that we're taking it a little bit more. How can we shift paradigms and think, let's use space more creatively and intelligently instead of just how do we get the same square footage that's being offered on the market today in a different size envelope? Because we got
Yeah,
it.
I think both Nancy and Stephen, you help complement the information that I put in earlier as a submittal about the opportunity to modify cottage housing and potentially revitalize an infill type ordinance of some sort. I think it really comes around to the aspect of proportionality. So you can work with a smaller lot if you have a smaller footprint of the dwelling that you're trying to establish. So as Stephen said, there's still room for you to have your car pull up to the dwelling. There's still room for a vegetable garden. Maybe open space, shared open space is part of the concept, Maybe it's just a smaller proportional footprint for the aspect of taking the price of the entire purchase down. But the tiny home industry and what's being offered out there, as Stephen has already said, intelligent design, I think, can take us a long way in comparison to the idea of just doing what we believe is what the market demands now. The market demands this because this is all that's offered.
And it's what the banks will fund.
Yeah. And I think if we have the right proportionality, I think the lending industry is there with the aspect of being able to do it. And you can get the pricing down to a significant degree. So yeah, everything that I put in earlier into the record, I think is really what we're talking about right now in that regard.
Great. Okay, Nancy, and then we're going to do a lightning round to finish up in our time. Go ahead.
Thank you. So, and also going back to how do we design? What are the design standards? Look at the demographics. Like as a member of the Commission on Aging, we're very concerned about the housing stock for the aging in place folks. Like Stephen, I'm so glad that you're also, singing that tune, because there's very little inventory. The townhouses are 3 stories going up with 2 flights of stairs. So if we were to encourage cottage housing and to kind of steer them towards single story, elder or older body friendly, I think that would really address a very necessary demand, but that's not necessarily put a lot of attention on. So that's another driver, aside from affordability, accessibility, to allow for the older population.
Great. Okay, so lightning round to finish up category B. We've got revising these ADU standards. We've got opportunities for protecting existing manufactured home parks and expanding potential for RVs and tiny homes. And we have some targeted rewrites to some of the transportation improvement standards. So lightning round from the 3 of you: priorities, areas that are missing or that should be rethought in those 3 categories to wrap up here.
Well, I think we still kind of get back to the idea that all of them have some validity towards a targeted product. It's still just not the same product. And the Highway 99 aspect, I think, is really good one to say it would take additional work to make that pay off. One of the things we didn't discuss is the idea in high density, creating incentives or rewards for even going maybe larger scale buildings than what the county is capped off now, creating the density while you still have all the transportation infrastructure and so forth. Something else that I think is potential is the idea of regionally shared stormwater facilities, so individual developments aren't stuck with the idea of trying to do their own individual stormwater retention facilities. It would be a place where the county would have to be pitching in, but the reward would be great in the aspect that you could turn it into some style of low impact public facility where you get stormwater infiltration and perhaps walking paths or something else of that nature.
Thanks. Yeah, I always wonder that about stormwater. Like, we don't expect people to have their own wells and their own septic. That's the whole point of being in urban areas. So why do we expect site-specific stormwater? Okay. Stephen, you have thoughts on any these last 3 in category B?
Not in particular at this point.
All right, Nancy, closing words before we jump over to category E.
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, then let's do category E. We've got about 9 minutes left to breeze through this, but this is, as Steve said, generally about new funding options. So I don't know where the priorities are to jump in through here, so I'll hand it over to you all and tell me if you want me to jump around in these different strategies, or if there are ones that stood out, or even if there's just questions that we want to bring back to the group.
So in the concept real estate excise tax, the REIT, do we know how much money is coming back for the county to deal with for funding? Because it seems like what we're really talking about is either purchasing land that's going to be developed for low income, or in some ways helping subsidize developers building for low income. And I know that home monies are a 2-year process for us to try and get in a granting structure. I don't know what else is really reliable in that regard. Comes from the feds, comes to the state, gets doled out to the county. How easy is it for us to control the funding and targeted portions of the citizenry?
Yeah, I don't have those numbers right now, but I've got that down as a question, so we can look into it. Yeah, so there's, yes, this additional REIT here that can be used. Okay. Housing trust fund, surplus land, thoughts about either of those? Yeah, Nancy.
Is that surplus public land?
I
And
think
what,
so, yeah.
so is that like
These are
swamp
county
land that
land.
they drain to, like, how, what would that be an example of? Like, do you know?
Yeah, okay, so I don't have a great Clark County example, but for example, when I worked in Ridgefield, the city had acquired some acres for a park, and then subsequently decided to relocate the park and acquired property somewhere else. So they had, 2 or 5 acres of what they deemed to be surplus land because it was no longer going to be used for the park facility. So they were able to sell that. I forget what they wound up doing with it, but in this case, they could have, I think what E3 is trying to get at is finding more of those surplus properties if the county has them, and then thinking about whether there are ways to sell or lease them at lower than market rates to, say, affordable housing developers in order to bring that cost down. This is all about finding money or cutting the price in category E here. So according to these notes, it says that the county's tried this, but there just aren't that many available parcels, right? They're not making any more land.
Yeah, good luck selling like brownfield converted housing. That could be interesting.
Yeah, that can come with a lot of costs, right? You might save a little upfront and pay for it on the back end. Yeah, any other thoughts through here of like different ways that the county could get more money to pay for affordable housing development? I think is what this strategy comes down to.
How about, sorry, I'm very chatty today.
Go for it.
How about like for developers, if they're not allocating a certain percentage to affordable housing on their own development, have them pay into then a fund so that the county can develop affordable housing. Just an idea.
So the idea where private market developers would contribute financially, either by setting aside some units in their project or paying into a fund to develop offsite. Okay, so that I think generally falls under the inclusionary housing policy, or inclusionary zoning, it's sometimes called.
Yeah, that might work if we levy some sort of additional tax on something and then allow it to be compensated in the form of affordable rather than paying the tax aspect. I think from what I've seen so far, they've had a very difficult time on inclusionary zoning, uh, where the number of units becomes a challenge between the nexus of profitable and making the project untenable. So when you lower the number of units to the point that you're offering a token 1 or 2 out of 30, they meet the criteria, but it's going to do nothing towards the idea of really giving us a change in the demographics of who's not able to be included right now. So working off of what you're saying, Nancy, it might be better if there was just a straight up trade. And that way it's easier to just do the build then rather than come up with additional cash that has to be turned out over for tax purposes exclusively.
Well, I see what you're saying, but I think, isn't there an existing law that they have to have certain development over a certain number of units need to have a percentage for affordable housing? I'm basing off of that understanding, but maybe I'm off.
Oh, not in Clark County. It is a tool that is sometimes used. City of Portland has it with, depends on which analysis you read, mixed results. So it is a tool. I would say, it's possible some sort of funding fund could be set up for market rate developers to pay into. But we, at this point, did not include an inclusionary zoning policy as part of our other regulatory strategies to require that inclusion of a number of affordable units within every development.
Okay.
Due to some of these concerns that Ron's talking about, and just the difficulty of calibrating it to get a meaningful number of units, but not discourage, not create such a high cost.
Can you go back to E1, please?
I sure can. And I'll also point out we have 1 minute and 23 seconds remaining.
Right. Yeah, okay. It was just really looking at the idea of the tax incremental financing, the potential for a TIF of supporting housing goals. So that would be just like roads, schools, things like that that are already being taxed. That's where I was really kind of going with it, Nancy, is you might be able to create something like that. And then if they create the units, then they don't have to pay the tax.
Right. So you change the presumption. It's not build it on site or pay in. It's everybody's paying unless you build on site.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. Well, thank you all for this great discussion. I'm going to turn us back over to the main room. I see from my notes, some of the other breakout groups are already there, so I'll see you all shortly. Thank you.